Welcome to renowned physicist Dr. Jeremy England, former professor of physics at MIT, author of Every Life is on Fire, and currently a machine learning researcher in the biotech industry here in Israel. Thank you. So we want to take this opportunity to thank Dr. England for giving us so many of his original and creative ideas in the context of these many shiurim that we've been having. Dr. England.
Thanks very much. So we have Chag Pesach coming up, and looking forward to that. I thought it would be interesting to talk a little bit about Makat Bechorot, the famous 10th plague in Mitzrayim in ancient Egypt, the striking of the firstborn, and look at it maybe from two different directions of questioning that might converge at some point and give us one point that we can pull together at the end. But I think this will be fairly loose and just raised from a few different sources for contemplation and discussion. But I think there are two kinds of things that we might typically ask about the striking of the firstborn. So just to review what happens there's been a series of plagues that strike Mitzrayim, the kingdom of ancient Egypt ruled by Pharaoh, who's refusing to let the Israelites, Bnei Yisrael, leave and go to freedom. And the culminating blow that is struck, that comes from Kadosh Baruch Hu, that comes from Hashem, who is telling Paro through Moshe that he has to let the Hebrews go. The culminating blow is the striking of the firstborn. And it's described as this single night in which there is across the land of Mitzrayim, both amongst human beings and amongst beasts, the first issue of the womb, the Bechor, the Ben Bechor, the male firstborn sons are killed, and you're not really told how. And it's this very striking event. What I mean to say, it's a very remarkable event that causes great notice and also great pain and suffering. There's this great cry that goes up in Mitzrayim because there's no house in which there wasn't someone dead. The Torah tells us, and then that's when Paro finally just gives in and lets them go. And so it's this dramatic culmination of a long process of trying to persuade Paro to let the people go. And I think there are two kinds of things we usually might ask about this event. One of them is, what exactly did happen, right? And obviously, it's easier to put that part of the text away if you approach it as a child might, meaning that you're told that Hashem came and killed all the firstborns of Egypt, and he can do whatever he wants, snaps his fingers, so to speak, and it happens. And there isn't anything to wonder about what the mechanism was. It can happen without an explanation. The text doesn't give us an explanation, so we shouldn't be interested in that. But if we want to, we can imagine the sort of Prince of Egypt movie kind of picture of some angel of death type breath coming through the land and going into all the houses and taking the lives of all the firstborn, magically, so to speak, except, of course, for the houses of the Ivrim, of the Hebrews, because they performed this special mitzvah where they slaughtered a lamb and they dipped its blood, or rather they dipped hyssop, they dipped ezov in its blood and used that to brush the blood on the mezuzot and on the mashkof, on the doorposts and lintel of their houses, and closed the door and stayed inside. And so we are told, as a result of that, there was this Pesach, there was this sort of, let's say, delaying or skipping over or limping, or however you want to translate the word, by the process of killing firstborns that Kadosh Baruch Hu set in motion, whatever that was, and it skipped their houses and they were spared. So we can, if we want, just say, I'm not bothered. The text tells me this happened, and it says quite explicitly that Hashem did it, and so nothing is beyond him. And if he wants to do it one way or another way, what do I care if the text isn't interested in telling me? Now, on the other hand, I think we still should ask whether the text actually is suggesting to us ways it might have happened more so than others, because very often what the Torah does is it is somehow a bit blank in what it tells us about a set of events, but it gives us more than zero information. And so we have different ways we could fill in the remaining blanks to kind of make a picture that makes sense. And we may learn something by trying to fill in those blanks, but the truth of what the Torah is trying to teach us clearly partly is about the fact that the blanks are there, right? That it doesn't want to tell us one thing. It doesn't want to, so to speak, point a video camera at a set of events and give us this extremely detailed, high resolution, streaming video account of all these different events happening in sequence with very precise chronology, and then say, well, that was it. That's what you should learn from. What it's telling us is no, the emet, the truth that we're supposed to learn, is on the one hand given kind of a skeleton by the text, but on the other hand, there are different ways that you could add flesh to the bones. And perhaps the fact that it admits more than one way of doing that is part of the truth it's trying to convey to us. And you see that over and over and over again. I think it's a very general principle across a lot of the narrative accounts that you get in the Torah. For example, in the binding of Isaac, the akedah Yitzchak, this is a moment when Abraham is asked by Kadosh Baruch Hu to go and bring his firstborn son, perhaps as a sacrifice on Har Moriah, which is the Temple Mount, Har Habayit, as we learn elsewhere in the tradition. And the actual pasuk that gives this command from Kadosh Baruch Hu to Moshe is V'ha'alehu sham lehola. You should make an elevation offering of him there. Now it's very complicated here to figure out exactly what that means, because ha'alehu, on the one hand, olah means a certain kind of offering, an offering that is completely burned up. It all goes up literally in smoke. But on the other hand, we're talking about going into a mountain. So there is another sense in which this all involves elevation. So ha'alehu could just mean bring him up. And unless, in case it might sound like this is an evasive sort of lawyering around with the text, this is something that Chazal do themselves, because they, with a play on words, quote a pasuk from Yirmiyahu Navi in their Midrashim, Lo alta alibi, which is a pasuk that comes from Sefer Yirmiyahu when he is excoriating pagans who are engaging in child sacrifice in Eretz Canaan. So it's exactly about how Kadosh Baruch Hu rejects child sacrifice. Lo alta alibi means literally it never arose in my heart. But they put those words in Kadosh Baruch Hu's mouth when he's speaking with Avraham Avinu in a midrash in Bereshit Rabbah, where he says Lo alta libi, meaning it never arose in my heart that you should sacrifice Yitzchak. And so in that sense, we're being reminded by Chazal that since HaKadosh Baruch Hu ultimately makes very clear he never will want or desire or accept child sacrifice, it cannot be the case that that's what he's saying to Abraham. And yet, on the other hand, if you just said, oh, it was a huge misunderstanding, Abraham should learn better Hebrew and have better grammar, and then he would have realized there was nothing stressful about this. He was just being told to go for a hike with Yitzchak. Clearly, the tension that exists in that moment is partly around the fact that there is a very reasonable interpretation of these words that does mean that he should have made an olah, made an offering out of Yitzchak. And if that possible meaning of the text isn't there, then part of the truth of that passage in Torah is lost. And perhaps the most significant part of it, because clearly part of what that passage is about is a commentary on the relationship of a zealous Oved Hashem to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and what it means to be willing to give anything in service of Hashem, who gave you everything that you have, right? So that needs to be there, but it also needs to be there that maybe that wasn't what HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, because Tachlis, bottom line, he doesn't want child sacrifice, and we shouldn't be unclear about that. So that's a very simple, and we'll find out, related passage or place in Torah where ambiguity or blanks or possible differences in interpretation, they really are different sides or perspectives on the same piece of narrative. And it's essential to the emet that we're being given, to the truth we're being given by the Torah, that it admits those multiple interpretations, because it doesn't mean the text admits any interpretation. It means that it admits more than one, and they're interlocking and counterbalancing in many cases. So what do we want to do with this when we bring this into discussing Makat Bechorot? Well, I said one question we can ask about it is what happened, and we'll get more into some speculation about that in a second. But I think another element that we should look at alongside that is with respect to Makat Bechorot, the striking of the firstborn. How should we feel about this happening? And I say this partly because, especially in the present era, there is probably more of a tendency, perhaps than there would have been in various other generations. There's more of a tendency to look at an event like this and say, well, the firstborn of Mitzrayim, well, surely there were babies in Mitzrayim, or very young children who had no part in the wrongs that were done to Bnei Israel, to the Evrim, to the Hebrews by the Mitzrayim. And so this is a terrible blow that's being struck against, in some cases, what you would call the innocent, the sort of the hapless bystanders who themselves didn't do anything wrong. And granted, in some sense, that is a somewhat imported concept that we have to be careful about, because it doesn't entirely originate in our own tradition, and is an easier question to ask with kind of the distortive glasses on of what seems normal from the perspective of a Western society that in some ways has different ideological foundations than our own. But on the other hand, it is true that that is not a totally illegitimate question to ask, at least insofar as there are sources in our tradition as well that around this same period, we read this in Hagada Pesach. It does raise the question of, how does Kadosh Baruch Hu feel about the fact that he's causing all of this devastation and suffering? There's a midrash that is told, for example, in the splitting of the sea, when all of Paro's soldiers and Paro himself are drowning in the sea, that the malachim, the angels, are singing in the heavenly assembly, and Kadosh Baruch Hu quiets them and says, "Why, my children are drowning, and why are you singing?" Now, people often miss about that source that Moshe and Bnei Israel are also going to sing, and that's not a problem. So they were given reshut, permission to rejoice, and it was appropriate for them to rejoice that their scourge had been laid to waste. But the malachim, who are the more impartial sort of heavenly principles that serve Hakadosh Baruch Hu in his domain, somehow it was inappropriate for them, in addition to joining the celebration, but maybe it was also tempting for them. So that source, I think, is often distorted in its modern reading as well. But we at least have the idea that there can be some notion of questioning whether Hashem is happy about what happens when some people who on earth seem in some sense to deserve what they get or not have to perish as part of his plan. So I think that's another thing that we can raise, as the kind of maybe the harder or the more speculative part of this discussion of, how do we feel about what happened? Is it good? Is it okay? Is it only okay because Akadosh Baruch Hu did it, so to speak? And it wouldn't be okay if we had to do it, right? Because there's a difference in our minds, perhaps, between some very ethereal and unclear notion of Hashem deciding to strike Mitzrayim because it's his world that he created and he can do what he wants, versus if we were deciding, for example, whether to visit a heavy or artillery bombardment on Mitzrayim, and we knew that, so to speak, many of the firstborns of Egypt who were quite young and didn't do anything to deserve it might ultimately perish as a result. Would we view that decision differently, and would we feel more uncomfortable about that? And then you could sort of ask, well, why should we? Should we feel equally comfortable either way, in one direction or the other? Meaning we should feel misgivings in either case, or we should say, look, if it's the right thing and it's part of the divine command, then why does it matter whether we're the ones doing it or whether it's an angel, so to speak, that does it? So those are all questions that I think that swirl around this issue, and I don't think we can resolve them all. And this show might be briefer than some, but I think it's just an interesting set of points to raise. And I just wanted to give kind of a strange and let's say alternative, but still I think arguably supported by some elements of the text, reading of what happens in Makat Bechorot that maybe speaks to both of these kinds of issues. So first of all, and I'm going to try to just bring in a bunch of sources in rapid fire and not go through them slowly on a source sheet, I think that hopefully it should hang together nonetheless. So first of all, one of the things that we can notice in the Torah itself, when it talks about Makat Bechorot, is that it really talks about it at least twice. I mean, really it talks about it many times, obliquely, but really even in a kind of detailed account of what Hashem is going to do or what he does, there are different passages that are occurring close together in Sefer Shemot, in the book of Exodus, which describe this. And one of them puts more distance between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the events than the other. So in one case, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying, I myself am going to go and strike the firstborn of Egypt. And then this is something that the sages take up in the Haggadah of Pesach, because there's very much the sense of not a malach, not an angel, but Hashem himself redeemed us from Mitzrayim. And that there was this great sense of Yad Chazaka Vizwan, like a strong hand and an outstretched arm. There was direct involvement, and somehow without all of this sort of multiplication of intermediaries. But what's also true is that there's a passage as well describing Makat Bechorot, where you have this term Hamashchit, the slayer, right? And Hamashchit, the slayer, is the one or the thing that does not go into the homes of Bnei Israel. And it's a lengthy passage, so I'm not going to read the whole thing, but does not go into the homes of Bnei Israel to kill them because of seeing the sign on the door, so to speak, right? That this whole promise that Hashem makes to pass over, as we translate it, the houses of the Ivrim, because they painted this blood on the door with the Azov, that is a result, is a sign to the slaying force that is somehow doing the will of Hashem and visiting this Makkah on the Mitzrayim. So there already is this kind of hint of, well, what is the mashchit? Is that an earthly mechanism for what HaKadosh Baruch Hu is doing? Meaning, as is the case in many other aspects of the Torah that seems sort of wondrous, should we start searching around and saying, oh, well, maybe there was an earthquake somewhere and it released toxic gases, different kinds of ways people try to explain it by sort of chaining together natural seeming events with particular timing. So is that what we're talking about when we say a mashchit? Or if not, then what is the function of that? And what does it refer to? What is it should be drawing our eye to? So there are two kinds of passages elsewhere in the Torah that I think may fuel a speculation that you can take or leave, because ultimately it's not something that you can, I think, make stand with certainty against all other possible interpretations of the text here. But I notice in this word mashchit that this is, first of all, a word that connects us to the events of a different mass destruction, where there was a different door that was slammed shut to try to protect people from what was going on outside, and where shortly afterwards a whole society was overturned. And that, of course, is Sdom v'Amorah. So Sdom is this place where a long time ago, Lot, the nephew of Abraham, has gone to live, and then he invites malachim, he invites angels or visitors, messengers, into his home, and the people of Sdom surround the house and are beating on the door and saying, bring these people out so that we may know them, perhaps in the sense of rape, or perhaps in the sense of they demand to know everything because they're keeping track of everything in their society. You can read it different ways. But the point is that there are some elements there that are a little bit already reminiscent, and indeed so much so that there is a famous midrash relayed by Rashi from Chazal, saying that when Lot was serving matzot to his guests in his home, Pesach Haya, it was Pesach. So we're told already we should be comparing the events of Sdom and this particular moment in Sdom when Lot is about to have his Yetziah, his exodus from Sdom, to what happens in Mitzrayim. And there is a shutting of a door and a sense of a danger outside that somehow can't find the door. So there are all these elements that line up there. And on top of that, there is this word mashchit, because the malachim, the angels or visitors who come to visit Lot, say that they're coming to destroy the place, and that's the root, the same root of the word that's used for Sdom, is Shin Het Taf. So again, you have this association of some kind of slaying force outside. But in this case, it's more obvious that there's a mob and they're trying to kill people or be very violent to them. And then the destruction we think of for stone comes from totally elsewhere, because then there's fire raining from the sky, and it seems to have nothing to do with what people are doing on the ground. But I think so. That's one passage and one source that I think we want to be bringing in and thinking about when trying to make some sense of this. Another one is from a different place. So there's a series of events towards the end of Yetziat Mitzrayim, or I should say towards the end of the Makot, the plagues that lead to Yetziat Mitzrayim, which begins with the Arbe, with the locusts, and then goes on to the Choshech, which is the darkness, and then culminates in Makat Bechorot, which is the striking of the firstborn. So Arbe, Choshech, Makat Bechorot. There's another place where we see a number of these words, in addition to other things that are the same, mention of 3 days, for example, and that is what I mentioned before, akedah Yitzchak. When Avraham Avinu brings Yitzchak Avinu up to Har Moriah, and then he doesn't end up slaughtering Yitzchak there, there's a whole lot of things that you have that line up with Makat Bechorot or the backstory leading up to it, which is the other Makot. So first of all, there's a Bechor. Yitzchak is a Ben Bechor. He's the firstborn to Sarah, because it goes by the mother. Then also you have this idea of ritual slaughter and an altar, and even an eventual sacrifice of a sheep of some kind on that altar, right? So it's not a lamb, but a seh, the word seh for lamb, which is used for Makat Bechorot, is also the lamb that Yitzchak asks about when he says to Avraham Avinu, Ayeh seh le'olah, where's the lamb for the offering? So ultimately it's an ayil, it's a lamb, sorry, it's a ram that's given as the offering. But originally the question that Yitzchak was asking was about a seh, a lamb. And so we have a bechor, we have a seh, we also have a mention of words that line up with the same set of events in Mitzrayim, because afterwards, when a malach, an angel, calls out to Avraham Avinu, he's saying to him that you've done a good job, so to speak. He says, "Vayikra malach Adonai el Avraham shenit min hashamayim, vayomer bi nishba'ati neum Adonai ki ya'an asher asita et hadavar hazeh, velo hasachta et bincha et yehidcha." כי ברך אברכך והרבה הרבה את זרעך ככוכבי השמיים וכחול אשר על שפת הים. וירש זרעך את שער אויביו. So an angel of God calls out to Avraham again from the sky, and it says to him, I'm sworn that you have, since you have done this thing and didn't withhold hasachta, like choshech et bincha et yechidecha, ki varech avarecha ve'arba arbe. And then the word arbe, this word, which in the context of this passage means I will make multiple, is also the spelling of the word for locusts, arbe. So we have choshech and arbe also appearing there. So again, a ritual slaughter that endangers a firstborn, and also we have darkness, and also we have locusts. So there's all these things that are pointing here to saying, think about the end of leaving Mitzrayim, the end of the Makot, and somehow understand it as connected with this passage here, where Avraham Avinu nearly is making an olah, an offering out of Yitzchak. So what do they have to do with each other? Other than some general, there's a firstborn son theme. So things with firstborn son themes should also have all these other decorations of textual references. But why? What's the point of that? Why is one of them related to the other? What should we be discerning? So I think all this just leads to a suggestion, which I don't think you can prove is correct. And I hope I made clear enough at the beginning of what I was saying, that when suggesting an interpretation, I'm not saying we've done it, we've figured this out, and now all the other proposals people make about the text don't have significance. The point is the blanks are there to be filled in different ways, and we learn from different ways of filling them in. So this is one way of filling them in that I think may actually be important for understanding something about Makat Bechorot. If we think about Avraham Avinu and the serious reading of the text, saying that he was commanded by Hashem to make an olah out of his son, his beloved son, right? To make a sacrifice where he would kill or slaughter and burn up his beloved son out of zeal, out of a desire to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Part of what the text must be referring to there is a very universal human desire, which is very dangerous and has to be channeled in the right way, which is that if there is a power, such as in the case of Abraham, the greatest power there is, the one true God who created the world, who's king of everything, to whom you feel that you owe fealty and you want to show your allegiance to him, then there is this desire we have to show we're willing to give anything. And in one sense, that isn't a wrong attitude to have towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We should desire to give him everything because he's given us everything, and we shouldn't withhold from him that which he's given to us as a gift. And so there is this element in what Avraham is seeming willing to do that it's very hard to just ignore, because it is a midat tovah, like a good attribute of a servant of Hashem, to say, I just want to know what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants, and then I'd like to do that. But what the text is showing us is that that is an extraordinarily dangerous impulse, because you don't actually understand necessarily what he wants. And that is even underlined by the fact that this word ha'aleo is ambiguous in its meaning. And maybe that isn't what HaKadosh Baruch Hu was saying, right? That's an important other aspect of the text. We don't necessarily understand what Hashem is saying to us. And so taking that zeal and saying, I will do what you ask, no matter what, because I'm devoted to you, but because I'm human and imperfect, I don't fully understand what you want. So now I might actually make a mistake about that, but be very zealous in doing the wrong thing, right? That is the road to child sacrifice. That's one thing that the akedah is telling us. That is the aspect of the akedah, I think, that's being referenced here. Now, why do I say that? Because think about what's happening in Mitzrayim. Now, when we go over to Makat Bechorot, what has been building up here? Mitzrayim is already basically destroyed. The Mitzrayim say that to Paro. They say, don't you know that Mitzrayim is lost? That already has been happening earlier on in the Makot. And there are, Mitzrayim, there are Egyptians who are described as being Yerei Hashem, that they fear Hashem, right? During the hail, which is the seventh plague, there already are Yerei Hashem who bring their animals inside because they fear Hashem and they don't want to show indifference to the might of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So there are Mitzrayim who at this point are filled with fear of Hashem, and let's say even a kind of a zeal, perhaps a desire even to please him or to propitiate him, right? They're pagans, and they think, okay, we now acknowledge that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is more powerful than any of the gods that we have ever seen. And we just want to please him or to satisfy him or to propitiate him or to get him to stay his wrath. So what would such a person do? Especially a Mitzri, someone who's been schooled in Egyptian paganism for the thousands of years that their culture originated. They would be willing to perform human sacrifice, of course, right? That is a very reasonable supposition, that the Mitzrayim themselves would perhaps hope vainly that they could stay Hashem's hand by buying him off, by giving that which was most dear to them as a sacrifice. So that's a proposal about what the Mitzrayim might be doing at this point in the narrative. And I'll say that it has another ring of truth, I would argue, because at the same time, it's also the case that there's something about Makat Bechorot that makes it stand out quite apart from other Makot, which is that it has this kind of heat-seeking missile quality to it, right? The other Makot, maybe the timing of them is surprising, that exactly when Hashem says, or when Moshe says, the frogs jump out of the water, or the frogs die, et cetera, or the barad, the hail will come. But it is at another level indiscriminate. The hail falls, and anything that's outside gets obliterated. And if you took something inside, then it doesn't. And maybe you could argue that you start to see, the darkness, the choshech, is applying to the Mitzrayim and not to the Ivrim. But there was a geographic separation between the Ivrim and the Mitzrayim, for example, and something that specifically goes amongst the Mitzrayim and only targets the Ben Bechor, the firstborn son. You just, with puzzlement, you have to look at it and say, how does it do that, right? I can explain anything else that's happened here as sort of, oh, people got a skin disease at a particular time, or there were lice at a particular time. But there's something that is very socially constructed about the idea of a Ben Bechor. It is also perhaps biological. So you could try to go in that direction. There are biological differences perhaps between the first issue of a woman's womb and everything that comes after, but compiling on top of that it has to be a male, and that it applies to beasts and to people. But I think there's another explanation here, which is that who's keeping track of who the Ben Bechor is? People. People know what a Ben Bechor is. That's something the Mitzrayim would have cared about, right? Because they would have put them in places of honor, and they would have perhaps also cared about that for their livestock. And so if we're going to go in the direction of saying, let's try to think of a naturalistic explanation for how something like this could happen, which I think you always have to do with the Torah, not because it excludes the other way of looking at it, but because the Torah admits that, and you can learn from that way of reading the text as well. It's part of Avodat Hashem to see the world that HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates as behaving according to the laws by which he wanted to create it. And if that's the case, then you don't necessarily get this sort of pause button for the way the world works. And you can ask, how would you kill all the firstborn in a society? You would do it with people. You would send people house to house, and you'd say, who's your firstborn? And you'd kill them. And you perhaps make them into a sacrifice in this case. So if you combine those different ideas, then I think what's interesting is suddenly the reference to Stom and the Mashchit, the slayer, makes a lot more sense. Because what are the Sodomites doing? What are the people of Stom doing? They're going to a house and banging on the door and saying, bring outside someone that we may know them. And really they have this sort of murderous intent, which we see, in other places. For example, in Sefer Shoftim, Pilegesh B'Givah is this story where something very similar happens with the tribe of Benjamin and Givah, and whoever gets pushed outside, in fact, is killed in addition to being raped. So there is a comment from Tanakh itself saying this really is about something lethal. But I think there's perhaps a sacrificial element as well, right? That it is perfectly plausible to imagine that in this frenzied moment, there are Mitzrayim going around house to house saying everyone in Mitzrayim has to donate, right? Everyone has to give a Ben Bechor, and we're all gonna sacrifice our Ben Bechor, and then afterwards, this is going to propitiate this fearsome and terrible God that we're trying to buy off because we're scared of him, and we may recognize his supreme power, but we may not yet understand what he wants from us. So why does that end up becoming, something that could make sense given what else we know about the text? Well, the last thing I'll just close with in terms of textual references is that the ritual given to Bnei Israel, which is this performance of a kind of a Korban Pesach, the first Korban Pesach, the slaughtering of the seh, and the dipping of Ezov, of hyssop in its blood, and putting that on the mashkof and on the lintel, and on the mezuzot, on the doorposts. If we now are asking, what could that possibly have done to prevent from happening what we now are imagining, which is that, like the people of Stom, the people of Mitzrayim are going and banging on the door and saying, everyone opens the door, everyone gives, and the Ben Bechor comes outside and we sacrifice the Ben Bechor. What would have spared a Ben Bechor in the house of an Ivri? How could this ritual with Korban Pesach have achieved that? And I think the hint of that might be in the one reference I've been able to find in Tanakh that explains to us what Ezov is. Because usually we have all these mentions of Ezov that have to do with halakha, right? There's the Tara of the Mitzorah, there's Para Aduma, there's this moment in Mitzrayim. So we know mitzvot that have been given where you do stuff with Ezov, but what is Ezov? Like, why not use oregano or some other kind of herb? Like, what is it specifically with Ezov? So Shlomo HaMelech And it says elsewhere, in this pasuk in Malachim, when it's talking about Shlomo HaMelech and how wise he was, how chacham he was, it talks about how he knew everything. He knew everything. He knew about the Erez in Lebanon, and also about Ha'ezov Asher Yotze Bakir. So that's what it says about it. First of all, I think the mention with the Erez in Lebanon is a bullseye, because Erez is not just a randomly chosen other plant. It's also a ritual plant that's used with Ezov, for example, in Para Aduma. So it's not just saying that Shlomo HaMelech was a great botanist. It's pointing out to you in the same passage, you should understand something about the ritual purposes of these plants by seeing how they're being described here together. But what does it say then about Ezov? It says Ezov is Ha'ezov Asher Yotze Bakir, that it grows out of the wall. It comes out of the wall. So you're imagining it kind of like you see maybe in the Kotel, right? That you have all these plants that are, because you have these very old stones and there are little kind of crevices in between the stones, that there are these plants that just kind of want to squeeze their way through and are living things that are stuck in the wall. How do we bring that into this reading of what's going on in Mitzrayim? Well, what does the presence of Ezov signify in this case? What is it telling us? That it's saying we're going to take this door and we're going to turn it into a wall. Meaning, you walk along, you're looking for houses to go to, and you're going to bang on the door and demand that they give the Ben Bechor for your sacrifice. But instead of coming to the door, you're going to come to what looks like a wall, and you're going to turn around and walk away. But the Ezov itself wouldn't do that. You can't just hide a door by putting Ezov on it, right? How can you hide a door? By covering it with blood. Why? Because if it's covered with blood, then the mob was already there, right? That if the mob is looking for places to do their mass ritual of blood because they're in this frenzy, then if they come to a house where it appears that has already taken place, they'll move on. So the function of the blood is to trick them up, right? The same way that the Malachim in Sdom blind the mob in Sdom with Senvarim so that they can't even find the door. But the way we're being told that you can't find the door is with the Ezov, because it's telling us it's like taking the door and making it seem like it's just a wall, meaning there's nothing on the other side. You're not going to open this. You're just going to walk right by it. Now, I would agree with anyone who would say this is all kind of tenuous and very carefully chained together and might therefore seem paper thin. And I wouldn't want to argue it's the only way of reading the text. The reason I think it's an important way to read the text is because I would argue it is there in the Torah and in Tanakh in general for us to extract and make some sense of here. And because it is there and the text is there trying to teach us something with it, I think what it's pointing to may pertain most to this question at the end of the day of what did happen, what actually happened, quote unquote, and also how should we feel about that, right? Who did it? And should we feel bad about it, or should we say it's not our problem and someone else did it? If you think about Sdom, it's interesting that what happened in Sdom is actually something that is kind of left off of camera quite deliberately. That when the wife of Lot looks back, she turns into a pillar of salt, and it's Eve Melach. There's this sense in which looking back and watching what happened in Sdom is not the point. And the Torah is trying to underline that very carefully for us, saying, at some level, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants you to focus on what he's telling you, and don't fixate on the details of exactly how this happened. Similarly, when we go over to Makat Bechorot, when it says Hashem did Makat Bechorot, when he struck the firstborn, does it matter if it's the case that it was a mob of Mitzrayim who did this to themselves, or that it was some kind of toxic gas that was floating around that got the Ben Bechor in some way we don't understand, or that it was something totally magical that we imagine, where there was, so to speak, a sort of malach mavet, an angel of death that came along and did this? What would be the difference amongst those scenarios? At the end of the day, whatever happens, whether it's the Mitzrayim doing it to their own children, or whether it's, let's say, another set of events for which the Mitzrayim seem less directly responsible, it's about the judgment of HaKadosh Baruch Hu that this should happen, that after it happens, we cannot say that Hashem did not want it to happen. we might say it pains him that it happened, right? That when things like this happen, it might still pain him in his heart the way it pained him when the Noachic flood, the Mabul, wiped out humanity. And I'll note, by the way, that in that moment also, this root, Shin Chet Taf, also appears. Shechet Haaretz, that the land had become corrupted. And so it's a word that appears with multiple mass destructions where you maybe see a divine hand in it. So maybe it pained HaKadosh Baruch Hu that this happened. But whether it happens by some magical mechanism that he sends, so to speak, and it's his judgment, or whether it's a mechanism you would call totally terrestrial and earthly, such as a mob of human sacrificing frenzied Egyptians who are trying to propitiate HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the pagan way they know. In either event, really it's Hashem who's deciding it's happening. And at some level, he's always responsible, and it always reflects his judgment. So this should at least cause us to step back from trying to decide whether we think it's something that the deserving or the innocent received or were spared from, as though we sit with the perspective of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and possess his judgment about it. What we can say is that in this moment, Hashem enjoins upon us the responsibility to recognize his hand in the events of the world. And so in this particular set of events, we emphasize that, yes, he was the one who chose it, as he was the one who chose every other thing that happened. And because of our emphasis on this, we can experience a particular kind of gratitude to him for the way that our nation was brought into being with this birth pang. And as a result, we are able to sing Hallel, to rejoice on Pesach, because we recognize that the world's creator has made a decisive choice to pave the way for our liberation. And we can always continue to seek relationship with him, to seek to understand his role in the shaping of events of the world. But we're never going to have the perspective that he does, either on what exactly happened, which we sometimes crave to know, or on the other hand, whether there was a fuller justice in what occurred than we're capable of seeing, if we could only but sort of sit in his throne, so to speak.
I see that that Ovadia Meir asked a few questions while you were talking about Avraham. Do you see them in the chat?
I'll pull that up now.
I can read it
Okay.
for you. Oh.
Sure. So we have, is that zeal without knowledge? So I guess that may be a question about Avraham. Well, maybe I should keep reading if there's an elaboration. That Avraham didn't know what Hashem would require of him was an act of trust. Some might say faith. Today we have the whole Torah written and oral, so he must act on knowledge. Yeah, so I think that is a good point, that much more so than Avraham Avinu, we now can say there are certain things that we're certain HaKadosh Baruch Hu would not command us to do, because he's told us very much the opposite, and then that is nailed down, and we're expected to base our attempts at understanding what he wants from us on a very rich starting point with a lot of content that we get from the written and oral Torah. However, I do think that even despite that, we can find ourselves often in these very analogous situations where there are decisions either to make in halakha, in questions of Jewish law, or more generally about how to live our lives, where there's still a lot of ambiguity in what the Torah is requiring of us, and different arguments to be made different ways. And there is this paradox of wanting to have this zeal for service of Hashem that you direct towards doing what he wishes, and at the same time, not being so sure necessarily always what it is that he wishes, which tempers our ability to act with confidence, perhaps despite cultivating that zeal in ourselves. And so I think one resolution of this in the case of Abraham, which really also is a bit of advice for us, I think, even though we have the Torah, is that it's resolved in stages. It's quite important, I think, that the first time this all gets kicked off, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says something to Avraham, and then he's off on his way, but that he's not just after that point, head down, only doing what he thinks Hashem wants without further contemplation or without further listening. So first there's a Vayisa Avraham et Einav, he lifts his eyes and he sees the place from far off, that he's going to perform this olah. But then later, there's also, the Malach calls for the first time to Avraham, there's an Avram, and it says his name twice. I think one of the reasons it says his name twice, and this is really reproduced in a lot of moments of Nivuah elsewhere in Tanakh, is that you need to be able to listen well enough for the voice of Hashem that you hear your name the second time, because you don't hear it the first time, because there's subtlety to how HaKadosh Baruch Hu speaks to us. And Avraham lifts his eyes again, Vayisa Avraham et Einav, and he sees, in this case, the ayil, the ram with its horns caught in a thicket, and he changes course. And so I think a crucial aspect of the personality of Avraham Avinu that we're supposed to carry into our Avodat Hashem is not just his zeal, which we see in his willingness to start on the path to this Olah, when that's the limited understanding he has, but also his willingness to change course when he further understands what Hashem wants from him, and then he's willing to change and reconfigure. So he doesn't just say, I heard the voice of Hashem once, I'm totally certain for all time that I know what it means. I'm not going to think anymore, I'm just going to do. From that moment on, he would be on the path to human sacrifice, right? What gets him off the path to human sacrifice is that he keeps listening and he keeps on being open to letting the voice of Hashem continue to change his heart as he walks the path, as he continues to act and do for the sake of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that doesn't mean it was a mistake to start on the path in the way that he did. It may have been indeed that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted him to be willing with his limited understanding to go to the top of the mountain, perhaps intending to perform the Olah, but the completion of that deed was his continued willingness to be open to further nivuah through further intellectual refinement of his understanding of what Hashem was asking of him.
Well, what's interesting about what you just said is that essentially, to put it a different way, had Avram Avinu not continued to listen, despite the fact that Hashem was calling him again, then essentially he would have been at that point listening to himself and not to Hashem.
Right. And I think it's not just a sort of a narrative accident of this moment. I think it's modeling for us the only way a human being can engage in some kind of dialogue with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because you can never get the full message perfectly the first time around. That is beyond us. We are not in the place to comprehend that which Hashem does in one moment of contact. And so the methodology that is being laid out is, if you're trying to shape your actions as you think Hashem wishes of you, then you shouldn't refrain from acting, because you can say, well, what do I know? I don't know the mind of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so I'm not going to bother to do what's being asked of me because I probably don't fully understand. So if I don't understand, I can't have zeal. I can't do what an Oved Hashem would do if only he could understand enough. And so I'll just sit here. No, what you do is you say, all right, I'll understand what is being asked of me as best I can, and I'll start on that path. And then I will change course accordingly, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu will keep on helping me to understand better if I remain open with my willingness to experience various things and include them in my cognition, and also for me to continue studying Torah, and for me to take those two things together, the created world and the Torah that I've been given to navigate it, and keep putting them together and taking another step and reiterating that process.
Just thinking of an interesting scenario where, had Avram been even more enthusiastic to carry out Hashem's will and moved a little bit faster, I suppose that just would have required Hashem to move even faster in responding.
Yeah, well, so that's something I've wondered about also. Like, I think in a completely unrelated way, seemingly, but I would argue that there's a similar model that you can explore in the text. So I was noticing once that we usually, when we read Sefer Yonah, we think Yonah is running away from HaKadosh Baruch Hu and he doesn't want to do what Hashem is asking of him. And I think that's a reading that's very important in the text, obviously. But what's also true is that when it says Vayivrach, that he, I don't want to pretend to get the pasuk exactly right, but that he fled milifnei Hashem. Milifnei Hashem, if you look at the usage of that phrase elsewhere, it is properly translated as at the behest of Hashem. Like Moshe does things milifnei Hashem elsewhere in the Torah. So if Yonah is going to Tarshish milifnei Hashem, then it's at the behest of Hashem, which means that you could say perhaps Yonah actually thinks he's on the right path, right? That he believes in order to go to Nineveh, that there's something he has to do in Tarshish first to kind of be ready to go there to prepare himself. And you could speculate about what that is. I think that becomes a whole longer discussion of other things in Sefer Yonah that I think are interesting. But the point is that does explain a lot of things in the text. If you take that to the text, why in the middle of a storm is he just taking a nap? And why is he not worried? He's just hanging on the bottom of the boat. And I think you could say, if you think you're on a mission from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then you could be that confident that you're fearless. If he thinks Hashem wants him to get to Tarshish, he's not worried about getting there. And so, he just hangs out. And then finally the captain says, okay, come up and call to your gods, because the captain's a pagan. And at that point, at a certain point, the storm becomes so intense that Yonah has to relent and realize, wait, I was wrong. I didn't understand what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted me to do. I'm on the wrong path, and that's what the storm is telling me. And so he tells them, the storm is because of me. Hashem is trying to stop me from going to Tarshish. And so throw me in the sea, because I'm still on my mission, and I still have ultimate confidence that if I'm on my mission from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that he'll provide what is needed for me to accomplish it. And indeed, he does, right? That the big fish comes and swallows Yonah. So normally being thrown in the sea would be certain death, but Yonah knows it won't be. So he says, throw me in the sea. I don't know how I'll get home, but he does, right? And as soon as he's in the sea, the storm quiets because he was right. So that's a completely different way of reading Sefer Yonah than you usually get, but I do think there's support in the text for that. And I think it follows this model with Avraham Avinu in similar fashion, right? That you do what you think Hashem wants you to do, because you're never going to get it right 100% the first time. You take a few steps, and maybe you get some positive feedback, maybe you get some negative feedback. You have to interpret that carefully, because sometimes he gives you challenges even when you're doing the right thing, and sometimes he is trying to stop you in your tracks because with a pure heart and good intention you're doing the wrong thing, and he wants to help you to figure out the right thing. So it's not easy to work out, but the Torah is supposed to be a guide, and it has to be a process of taking steps and continuing to be open and reflective.
Right. Well, what was required and is required is good faith and the desire to carry out the will of Hashem, which Avraham Avinu had,
and a willingness to study in order to figure out what that is, and a willingness to acknowledge reality, which is another important component of that.
And to listen.
Mm-hmm.
To know what Hashem wants of you, you have to listen. Right.
You have to listen for his voice rather than only to your own heart and its either desires or even the intellectual peace it's made with its imperfect understanding.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.